Good morning. Welcome to part 2 of this year's Maritime Reads for our 6th annual Maritime Month in honor of Gordon Goodwin. Last week we started discussing the book Disaster on Devil's Bridge by George A. Hough Jr., a local author and reporter here on the Vineyard. He wrote a book about the vessel City of Columbus, a steamer from its day. It was launched in 1878 and it ran aground off the coast of Aquina on Devil's Bridge in January of 1884, allowing it just over 5.5 years of good sailing. So last week we heard from the author in the introduction and the foreword about how when he was a boy, the city of Columbus was talked about frequently in local oral lore. Because of that, he wanted to look into it as an adult, and he wanted to give a story to the passengers that died. It was covered as a big news event in its time, but unfortunately, many lives were lost, as well as many records. So today we'll start with chapter 1, Setting for Disaster. The City of Columbus story could only have happened as it did, where it did. Fate chose a unique background. The scene shaped the event. The setting was Vineyard Sound, a wide, tide-swept strait, which as today, separates Martha's Vineyard Island from a cluster of islands known as the Elizabeths, off the southern coast of Massachusetts. Vineyard Sound had been a watery highway since colonial times, especially busy during the years of coasting schooners. The island of Martha's Vineyard is a triangle 20 miles long and 5 miles at its widest. The port towns of Vineyard Haven and Eggertown and their hospitable harbors are at the north and east shores. Standing high on the western shoulder of the vineyard is the promontory of Gay Head, breasts the open Atlantic like a ship's prow. This prow, at places 150 feet high, is a broken series of precipitous and gaudy clay cliffs. Atop these heights of colored splendor, a light has flashed its warning signals since 1798. The first lamps burned whale oil. A new tower was completed in 1859, and in it was installed a lens which was to guide mariners for just short of a century. The lens itself was a wonder in its day, a ring of prisms of glass which concentrated a single giant beam of light. Constructed in France for the United States government, this Fresnel lens cost $16,000. From its 41-foot tower, it flashed its concentrated beam 20 miles seaward. As an aside, you can see the Fresnel lens today at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. I highly recommend going to check it out. Then there were the Indians. Their reservation became a town in 1870. When whale ships of the coast began to go into far seas, the Gay Head Indians went with them. The City of Columbus story could not have reached its heights of human achievement but for the Vineyard Indians. In 1880, the population of this Indian town was 161. Homes of wood and stone perched starkly on the highland. The brick lighthouse and the little meeting house, on its own eminence, dominated the landscape. Tucked away on the shore was the shelter for lifeboat maintained by the Humane Society. Rolling with the ocean swells off the base of the towering clay cliffs was the buoy marking the Devil's Bridge, an outcrop of rocks spread over almost a square mile. Shipping gave it a wide berth, hugging the high banks of the Elizabeth Islands 4 miles across the Vineyard Sound. Of all the craft which came to grief here, the City of Columbus was the unluckiest victim. The wrecker of steamer City of Columbus shocked the country as no like disaster has in years, reported Harper's Weekly. Journal of Civilization, days after the event, quoted, "It was so sudden, so complete, so terrible, and we must add, so cruelly causeless. In this paragraph, an unremembered editor epitomized for all time the Devil's Bridge disaster of Friday, January 18th, 1884. For those who missed last week, George A. Hough published this book in 1977. So if the language doesn't seem like it's up to today's standards, that is why. The next chapter, he gives an introduction about the Boston and Savannah line, the steamer line that the city of Columbus was a part of. Essentially, he describes how this ship built in Savannah, Georgia, its main purpose was to bring cotton from the southern states north to the mills in Massachusetts, Vermont, Connecticut, other places, and to bring the fish caught in the north south, namely salt cod. What was quick transportation for the era brought early vegetables to Boston markets in appetite-tempting succession. Later in the season, watermelons came north in quantities which filled between decks capacity of vessels. From November to February, Boston received 200 to 600 crates of oranges a trip. Passenger traffic was also stimulated. New Englanders went south for the winter and Southerners came north to escape the summer heat. Train travel meant car changes and hotel stopovers in New York City. The sea voyage cost less than half that of rail. 3 days at sea seemed not overlong. On December 31st, 1883, the city of Columbus beat the Savannah to Boston passage record by 5 hours. She came north in 75 hours. So, not unlike the disaster of the Titanic, the city of Columbus was quite a vessel for its day. In another chapter, the author describes the vessel in detail. I'm going to skip over that because I think that talking about the passengers and the crew and the disaster itself is a little bit more interesting. The city of Columbus was built launched June 19th, 1878, and built in Chester, Pennsylvania. She was launched out of Savannah, Georgia, and she had a generator and a 5,000 candle power searchlight on the bow, specifically for navigating the Savannah River at night. She was fully insured. Bostonians were impressed when she came into their port 4 years later. The Boston Evening Transcript called the steamer a floating palace. There was indeed elegance in the salons finished with exotic French walnut, mahogany, rosewood, and bird's eye maple. The city of Columbus was licensed to carry 200 passengers. Federal inspection certified she carried all the life-saving apparatus required by law. Every stateroom had life preservers for each berth. There were 6 metal lifeboats and a life raft. Captain Schuler E. Wright, the steamer's master on this ill-fated voyage, was less than 2 months past his 52nd birthday. A native of Wareham Village on Buzzards Bay, he had gone to sea at 13, and at 38 was master and licensed pilot aboard the Alhambra, one of the first Nickerson ships on the southern route. The Columbus was Captain Wright's 5th command. The record of this veteran was distinguished by devotion to duty. A master, Captain Wright never took his clothes off from beginning of a 3-day voyage to its end. He insisted the door between his stateroom and the pilot house of the steamer was never closed. First Officer Edwin Fuller of Barnstable on Cape Cod was also both licensed master and pilot. Fuller was 52. He came to the Columbus from service as master on steamer Seminole, which plied the Boston and Savannah route. Sailors called Fuller a lucky man. He had been at sea since boyhood and come unscathed through several shipwrecks. The second officer, another Cape Codder, was Augustus Harding of Chatham. Harding was 27 and son of a Cape Cod shipmaster. He had been 3 years on Columbus and earlier on other southern vessels. Harding never got around to qualifying for his pilot's license. Captain Wright thought highly of him. The captain called Harding a good pilot. Seamen aboard were long at their calling. Roderick A. McDonald, quartermaster from Boston, was 35 and 15 years at sea. Edward Leary, bow watchman, had spent 14 of his 27 years on the water. The crew was well salted with products of the sea-girt northern shores of Newfoundland, Cape Breton, and Prince Edward Islands. Purser William C. Spaulding of Boston was an accountant before he joined the Columbus on her maiden voyage out of Boston. As steward, Andrew F. Pittman of New Bedford was in charge of the inside of the ship. He was a veteran of 10 years on the Fall River line. The stewardess, 37-year-old Teresa Jane Smith, hailed from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. She was eldest of the 13 children of Captain Amaziah Smith. Family tradition asserts Captain Smith swore none of his sons should follow him on the sea. Teresa, first of the brood, sailed as a child with her mother on her father's ship. She alone of the 7 sons and 6 daughters chose the sea for a livelihood. Altogether, the city of Columbus carried 6 licensed officers and 39 men. Of these, 28 were soon to die, and 17 were to live only by surviving hours of harrowing exposure. The added toll of passengers brought a total of 103 out of the 132 aboard who would not survive the disastrous night. Like I mentioned last week, there are photographs and maps throughout the book. So this is Mrs. John A. Atkinson, who died with her son, nephew, and parents in the wreck. The passengers that survived reported that on the afternoon of January 17, 1884, the city of Columbus moved away from Nickerson's Wharf in Boston. Friends and relatives waved farewells, and for the passengers, 87 in all, the voyage was a break, short or long, in busy lives. They were folks with other folks waiting for them in the South, with minds full of all they were leaving and keen with plans to be realized at the journey's end. They were everyday people of their time, as they would be in ours. Always among the everyday Americans are those of unusual means and good fortune, of noteworthy achievement or enviable social position. Such there were among the travelers who settled into the cabins of the city of Columbus that January afternoon. The many had much to live for. The failing and the aged at least had hopes. They were drawn from maritime provinces and 5 New England states. They came to the Washington Street ticket office in Boston from all around Massachusetts. The young Farnsworth brothers, bound from Jacksonville, were from Townsend. Helen Brooks, retired piano manufacturer, was from Northborough. Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Richardson were from Everett. He was 52, a Boston beef merchant, and one of the town's largest taxpayers. Mrs. Richardson was sailing reluctantly. Although the idea of the trip south had been hers, she was now hesitant to leave her children. Mrs. Dwight B. Rich from Hyde Park was going to visit her husband's grave in Florida. Fugitives from the cold were Henley L. Batchelder, retired coal dealer of Dorchester, and Mrs. Batchelder. A family of 5 from Woodstock, New Brunswick, were ending a sad day as they waved from the departing steamer to a lone man on Nickerson's Wharf. Mrs. James Beale of Mattapan and her 18-year-old daughter Inez were bound to join husband and father who had gone to Florida for his health. Traveling with the Beales was their friend, Mrs. Perinthe A. Whitcomb of Boston Highlands. Mrs. Sarah J. Pinkham of Dover, New Hampshire, was looking forward to a new life in Sanford, Florida. She was 45, and her 28-year-old son, happily recovered from serious illness, had built a home and invited his mother to live with him. 2 mothers traveling with small children were anticipating family reunions in the South. Fred H. Tibbetts had property to attend in Silver Springs, Florida. There were others on business bent. Frederick Hale, 37, was on a buying trip for a Boston produce farm. G. Fred Hammond of Hyde Park was a drummer. Craftsmen aboard anticipated finding winter work in the southern states. Here's a young child who died on it. His family quoted him as one of the prettiest children I had ever seen. Captain Thomas R. Hammond of Goldsboro, Maine. Mrs. Elizabeth Davis from Lynn. The future was bright for Howard Derlin from Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. The Hutchinsons from Cape Elizabeth, Maine. The Rands, who had a family party. Nathaniel J. Morton, reporter on the Boston Globe. Teresa Jane Smith, the lost stewardess that we talked about, stands behind her mother in a group photo with her siblings. And I think you get the picture. There were so many people with so much life left to live. The cargo on this last voyage was light, but as representative of New England as the ship's passengers. Below decks were boxes of salt codfish and cases of baked beans. There were barrels of rum, packages of bacon, nests of tubs and cases of boots and shoes. There was also a carriage boxed with wheels and shafts crated. And we know from last week, there was a lot of butter on board. So just quickly, we'll go to a map here. So this is a map of the Vineyard Sound, and there's 3 routes highlighted. 2 of them are green. Those are the course that 1, the steamer should have been on. 2, once the captain gave correction, the steamer should have been corrected to. And the 3rd one, that's highlighted in orange, was the route, unfortunately, that the steamer actually ended on. They know these routes because Captain Wright survived the disaster, so they were able to speak with him in depth at the end. So next week, we will talk about the actual grounding of the ship, what transpired after, and how the locals of Martha's Vineyard were able to come together and go into the freezing waters in January to rescue those who were able to be rescued. Thank you for joining me. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday, and we'll see you next week.